My group of questions is called Voice of Rights Holders. And I'm going to be contentious in my answers to these questions. Can you advocate for those who do not wish to be involved? Can rights holders actually participate? Whose voice do we represent, and how do you avoid interpreting? And my contentious answer is yes, no, none of those things. You cannot advocate on behalf of anybody else. You advocate on behalf of yourself. And any organization that is involved in advocacy has its own interests that it's promoting. It may tactically use the voices of other people, and it may purport to represent the interests of other people for the sake of strengthening its argument. But any organization has its own interests at heart whenever it's engaged in advocacy. They may be very altruistic interests, but they are its own interests nonetheless. And so the challenge, I think, in front of us is to be very explicit about those, about the value set, the motives that we bring to an advocacy initiative, to analyze the impact on others and to manage the risks of that, but never kid ourselves that we're doing it for somebody else. We're doing it for ourselves.
I like a man who gives strong and brutal answers. Now I see how it feels like when I do that. And it is unsatisfactory. After the initial moment that you say, yeah, sure, you start wondering, but you have only displaced the issues rhetorically by answering that way, according to me. I.e., sure, it's nice to say, we speak for nobody, we only speak for our own interests. Yeah, fine, okay, yeah. Courageous man, but you have only displaced the problems, because all the problems still remain then of what is your legitimacy to do that, and how would you know what the impact is on others? If others could speak and you're speaking louder because you're in a better place to speak loudly, is that right? Is it efficient? Is it sustainable? All the questions really still remain. You haven't solved them, you just have given them a nice spin for a moment.
In certain situations where the community people cannot speak for themselves, I think even as an international NGOs, we can speak on behalf of those people, because sometimes we'll have access to different information and we'll know how the international system works. Rather, the community may not know how the system functions. So in such cases, I think we must have the legitimacy. We must have worked with the community so that we can speak on their behalf through our legitimacy. But I think we can also speak on behalf of the community sometimes. But our work right-based work should be clearly focused on gradually building the capacity, so that later on they gradually become able to speak at the international level as well.
When I was in Sudan and Oxfam at the time, when I was working for Oxfam, we got in a little bit of trouble, as I'm sure lots of you know, for being quite critical of the government of Sudan, or that's how it was interpreted. And the government of Sudan called us in, they said, look, we can see what you're doing, you NGOs. MSF will release a press release one week, then Oxfam will do one the next week, then Amnesty the next week, and you'll build the pressure. I thought that's a very good idea, because it simply wasn't happening at all. So I do think we can be more ambitious in terms of how we approach things. And I do think if we are clever and creative about it, we do have more room for manoeuvre than perhaps we sometimes estimate.
For me, I think it's a question of clearly analyzing the situation that you find yourself in. And of course, when you talk about duty bearers, we all very rush into highlighting government, the state and the state. But in a conflict situation like ours, for example, in Sierra Leone, where we had the rebel forces that were at some point in charge of, that were controlling exclusively certain areas in the country. You know, the country was divided, and this sort of group is in charge of one area, another group is in charge of one area. Then the dilemma is, who are you advocating to, and what will you advocate for? And as I said in my group, considering again what is available, what you know is even within the capacity of the duty bearers here. I mean, they have a duty to provide something that they do not have the resources to provide.
Because if we tried to get a standing coalition on Darfur, for example, and everybody to sign up to a centralised strategy, which everybody had to agree to all the different bits, it would be a disaster, and it would take 15 years to create, and by which stage, hopefully, the conflict would be over. But what you can do is to say, okay, well, here's a piece of private lobbying that we think it would be useful to do collectively, for example, targeting the General Affairs Council at the European Union level, and different groups can buy into that and say, okay, I'll do this bit, I'll do this bit, I'll do this bit, and lots of the groups who perhaps can't do things publicly can do that, whereas as part of the same strategy, but operationalised by different organisations, those organisations who can then talk out can do some of the public pressure. So the Amnesties, the Human Rights Watches, the ICGs, who can be much more public, can do put out press releases criticising the European Union for an action, for example.
If you're an international NGO, I might say don't bother trying to create a solid, effective coalition of civil society organisations in a given country in order to effect real change. Because if it's going to be possible for that coalition to be created, then it's probably going to happen the way that it did in Nepal. And I agree with Stephanie that that the question should be thrown into the audience, because I think that the experience of Nepal with the popular movement and the peaceful uprising in April last year, leading to an end to absolutist royal rule, is an incredibly important one. And one of the interesting and defining characteristics of Nepalese civil society organizations, so far as I have seen, is their tremendous and very resilient independence. And their, I think, quite appropriate wariness and carefulness about taking outside guidance, leadership, financial support, and so on. So one answer to the question would be, if you're an international NGO, don't bother. The second answer to the question would be also, actually, don't bother. Because I think that what is the real goal, right? Is the real goal to win an issue? Or is the real goal to help in the development of a vibrant civil society which is going to push forwards people's rights in that country and is going to, where real change is needed, is going to affect it? If that's the real goal, a vibrant civil society, the sort of the mechanisms and the cartwheels that you have to go through in order to create single, solid, effective coalition might actually be counterproductive. It might not simply be effort wasted, but it might actually be counterproductive. Because a vibrant civil society is one which disagrees with itself, loudly, noisily, irritably, and in the course of it bats down attacks on its rights and moves things forwards. And I think that sometimes we can get a little bit too mechanical in our approaches to these things. Just to sort of take one step away from this session, I would say that right-based approaches shouldn't necessarily and always lead you towards advocacy.
That there's a danger that INGOs in particular can come with quite an external agenda and push for things which perhaps the local NGOs might not be pushing for. That would be a difference of analysis. I think interestingly in the group that I was sitting in, there's a colleague here from Afghanistan who I can't now see. Oh, she's left. Okay, in that case I can make it up. But I think what she said, I think what she was saying was that in the case of Afghanistan, there was a danger, in fact, where because INGOs were so worried about their own cultural imperialism, there was actually a danger that they were not talking out about women's rights as strongly as they could have been because they didn't want to be seen as being culturally imperialist. And therefore, it was actually setting back the agenda of people like her who work for national-based NGOs who are campaigning on women's rights. Is that anybody else in my group? Was that vaguely what she said?
The international agencies were choosing topics on which to advocate, which were actually getting organisations like hers into trouble. For instance, the example she gave was advocacy around people's, I'm presuming here, but people's freedom to convert from Islam to Christianity. Agencies were advocating for that to happen. So what she was saying was that then her organisation was seen as being aligned with this, which would be an incredibly dangerous position for her and her organisation then to be in. When they do take a stand, the international agencies, they tend to take a stand without enough understanding of context and then go and maybe screw it up for everybody else within the country.
I'm not actually going to try to summarize. I'm going to try to follow a line of thought which at least touches on parts of what we've been talking about in this last session, and therefore I presume to some extent over the last 2 days. When I was a young man, which is an extraordinarily long time ago, I really believed in the importance of taking a stance. I thought that was the key thing. You've got to take a stance. You've got to stand up and be counted. Right? You've got to know who you are. You've got to know which side you're on. Stand up and be counted. People who didn't want to stand up and be counted, I could turn very arrogant towards in the process of taking a stance. Now that I'm unbearably old, I sort of think about things in terms of, no, what I want to do actually is achieve change. And I want to be part of processes which achieve change for the better in people's lives. And there are different ways in which one can do this. And taking a stance and being strident and wagging one's finger is sometimes, in the right circumstances, the thing which needs to be done. Whether in all circumstances I am the person who needs to be doing that, or whether there are other people who need to be doing that, that's a question to think about. There are also other ways of taking a stance, perhaps, than simply that loud, strident, youthful, exuberant former me, the way that I thought of things then. There are also other things to do which are persuasive, which are going to win points, which are going to influence people, apart from just that sort of that taking a stance. As I say, in International Alert now, we think very much about this concept of non-confrontational advocacy. That is to say, advocacy in which one is trying to, you have an agenda, you have an objective that you're trying to achieve with these people, who may be office bearers, they may be politicians, they may be influentials in a given society. It would be perfectly open and straightforward. You have an agenda, you want to achieve change in attitude and behavior. But the way to achieve this is not necessarily through that more confrontational style of argument and advocacy. It's through engagement. Engagement in dialogue, engagement in a process of learning together, in which you perhaps learn as much as any other participant in that process. And along with this, I think, then goes that, of course, there are, alongside of this, other things which are not advocacy at all, which are also a part of being effective and achieving change, and change for the better in the lives of ordinary people. And I think that some of the questions which have come up, which it's right to come up, for example, questions around coalition, or questions around partiality, questions around independence, about security, and so on, are in some ways, if not answerable, at least manageable questions. If one starts to recognize that there are many different kinds of advocacy, and there are other things to be doing which reflect a rights-based approach to development or to peace building or to conflict resolution, as well as these various different kinds of advocacy. And what I've heard in a way this afternoon, kind of semi-bubbling under the surface rather than being made explicit all the time, is that there is a whole range of different things which can be done. And advocacy as, what should I say, as classically conceived or as normally understood, as normally expressed, is one of those ways of working. Sometimes what's most needed is just to get one's head out of a single rut and think about that broad range of possibilities and decide within them which is the quickest and the most effective and the most productive way towards a given goal. And that goal, it seems to me, as I say, having grown up, it's not about taking a stance, it's about achieving effective change.